For the first time ever, the World Trade Organization has a binding agreement to stop harmful subsidies that drive overfishing. But not every country is on board. I sat down with Dan Skeritt from Oceana, who's been following these negotiations for years to unpack what this agreement actually means. We talked about how billions of dollars in subsidies have propped up unsustainable fishing fleets and why some of the biggest fishing nations have yet to ratify the agreement. Dan gives a breakdown of subsidies, the World Trade Organization, why this is all important, and what we need to know about this agreement and how it's going to move forward. Now, as someone who's been covering ocean issues for a long time, I can tell you this agreement feels like a turning point, but it's also a test. Will countries follow through? And to be honest, that's up to me and you. We're going to talk about all this on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. Now, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about subsidies. We're going to be talking about the World Trade Organization's new agreement on fisheries subsidies, how to handle fisheries subsidies. Now, subsidies is also a term that we're going to be discussing, why it's important that we need to know about this type of term and why it's important and how it drives fisheries for a lot of countries. We talk about harmful subsidies, we talk about beneficial subsidies, and we talk about how there's really no legal framework of how to dole out these subsidies within each nation and how there's not a lot of checks and balances when it comes out to being like, are the fleets and companies who are receiving these subsidies, are they actually following the law? Or are they making sure that these fleets are following the law? There's a lot of things that go on. And as taxpayers, we don't like to fund stuff that doesn't follow the law or people aren't, in it for the best of the country that you're part of, right? As taxpayers, we don't want to have to deal with that. We don't want to have to prop up specific industries so that, they can just do whatever they want. That's not fair. That's not what these subsidies are for. These subsidies are to benefit not only the industry, but also the citizens of that country or part of the citizens or part of that nation of that country. And so I think it's really important to have this type of agreement. But when you have this type of agreement, as Dan mentions, there's a lot of context within that. There's a lot of legal frameworks and legal words and phrases that are very difficult to understand. Spoiler alert, there are loopholes, and Dan and I discuss that, and we try to look at how to move forward with this agreement and what it looks like and the impact we think it will have. So without further ado, here's Dan Skeritt talking about the World Trade Organization agreement on fisheries subsidies. Enjoy the interview, and I will talk to you after. Hey Dan, welcome back to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about the WTO subsidy agreement?
Hi Andrew, yeah, really happy to be back. Always ready to talk about subsidies. Yeah.
All right. This is great. This is something that it came to be because you contacted me. You're like, Andrew, I'm not sure if you've heard, but there's a really great agreement that's coming out. This was last week when you contacted me, and I was like, okay, let's do this. We need to get this out. We're going to be talking about fisheries subsidies and sort of the agreement that the WTO has come out and said, hey, you know what? We need to establish some rules here of who gets subsidies, who doesn't, and what countries can do when they give out subsidies and what rules they have to abide by or they should abide by based on a lot of expertise over the years and what we've learned over the years about global fishing and even fishing within our own countries. I just want to premise this. This is a great first step, and we're going to celebrate that here. But this is the first step in a long battle towards getting, subsidies handled properly, especially when it comes to illegal activities and illegal fishing and everything that goes around with overfishing. So Dan is super happy for you to be here to help us break it all down and just really get to sort of all the information that's given out in this agreement. So we really appreciate you being here. Before we get into all that, though, Dan, why don't you just remind the audience here of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I'm Daniel Skeritt. I'm a senior manager in Oceana's Science and Strategy group. We're kind of a bit like the research and development team in Oceana. So we support all our various country offices, but also do a bit of, novel research. My particular area of research is on international fisheries, so that's why I study things like fisheries subsidies, as we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and it's going to be amazing because when we talk about what you are on here to talk about and what your expertise is in, it is a broad field. That you could go into a lot. We were just talking before we record about technology and how to monitor better overfishing and to understand it and to act on it and so forth. And then there's also like the policy aspect of everything and how to get countries on board to an agreement and to ratify these types of agreements that we're going to talk about today, to put action into place. Because we can talk about it, we can do a lot of research on it, and we can identify the problems, but until governments start to enact these types of agreements and make sure that they put it in their own legal context, nothing is going to get done. And the more countries we get to ratify this agreement and agree to this agreement, then it's going to be amazing. So let's get started here. Why don't we just break down, who the WTO is, why it's important that they come up with this agreement, and how this whole agreement came to be.
Yeah, I'll try and give kind of a brief history of that. So the
Go
WTO,
into a lot of detail.
Yeah.
We've got hours. We've got.
Yeah, and just to caveat that I'm not a trade kind of expert.
Right.
My background, as we talked about last time, is in fisheries. I then studied fisheries economics for quite a while. So I've been working on subsidies for almost 10 years, which in the world of fisheries subsidies is I'm very much a newcomer to it. So I come from a kind of economics background, but not a trade expert. But the World Trade Organization was established, so it's based in Geneva in Switzerland, and it was essentially established to try and organize trade, global trade. So to try and usually to break down barriers to ensure like more free trade. So any kind of barrier like tariffs and things like that, which obviously have been in the news a lot at the moment, they're kind of the governing body of that try and help facilitate easier trade around the world in order to reduce poverty, I guess, or to improve, GDP in various countries, to connect the world. So, if there's a trade dispute, that will go to the WTO. So that's their background. Fisheries subsidies for the WTO is quite an interesting topic, because at the heart of it, although it's around trade, it's around unequal competition or the kind of the distortion of markets that fisheries subsidies can have. This agreement at its heart has sustainability, environmental sustainability, and so this is the first time the WTO have really brought together an agreement that kind of focuses on environmental sustainability. So it's quite a new thing for them. I say new. They started these negotiations in 2001 at their fourth ever ministerial conference in Doha in Qatar, and they agreed. The text of the agreement in 2022 in Geneva at their 12th ministerial conference. So 21 years of talking and negotiation to agree to the text of this first part, this Fish 1. And then another 3 years after that for countries to kind of take that text away, to ratify it into their own law, and for it to have come into force, just last week. So, please feel free to ask any more questions. That's kind of a brief overview of who the WTO are and what they do.
Well, I just wanted to, one thing that I'm always interested in as a marine biologist myself, and you have the very similar background. Obviously, you have a PhD. You've been studying fisheries for quite some time. I was always growing up in this industry. I was in this field. I was always of the matter of, it's interesting how certain organizations like the WTO, like the World Trade Organization, even CITES, which is all about trade, have such a huge impact on what is traded and like fisheries traded and where the money goes, and as well like with CITES, like what items cannot be brought past a specific border and so forth. And I find it interesting when we discuss this type of work, that fisheries itself, like when you look at doing the fisheries models and looking at, okay, we have fisheries models, we know what we can catch, we know how much we can't catch, we're setting the quota here. How come we need like the World Trade Organization or CITES to regulate this trade when, in my opinion, science should be enough? So that's sort of where I'm at with this. Like, I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah. That's a great question, a great point, and quite a frustrating situation that we see quite a lot for us. I think And there was a great article actually that just came out I saw yesterday about this. I think the issue, part of the issue is, fisheries, although they are, essentially this. So you can see them in kind of two lights, and we were kind of talking about this a little bit before we start recording about depending on the lens through which you see, fisheries or this agreement. So a lot of us with a fisheries background see it through a biological or an ecological lens, right? This extraction of these animals out of the environment, and so our models are often built around that idea of the population, how much fishing can it take. But obviously, the other huge part of it are the people, and in the case of industrial fisheries, the businesses, right, that are extracting these resources. And if you see it from a kind of economics or trade heavy lens or focus, then your priorities might be quite different, or the goals that you have for this fishery might be quite different. I mean, I think the frustration is that many of us see that, like, well, surely the first principle should be like, you can't keep fishing if the biological sustainability is flawed or you're overfishing, right? But I guess it becomes very murky, especially with these international fisheries when there's all this like competition and trade, and I feel like that can kind of add to it. So I think all these elements are important, and I think fisheries as a whole. So you need these kind of this economic understanding, and you need political will. I think that's the other important thing. When there's these resources out there that could be extracted, especially when it's in other people's waters or the high seas, right? I think especially in the high seas, you can end up with this kind of race to fish, and so I think it's because probably there's it's a lot more complicated, sadly, than simply here's what the science and what the biology of this fishery says, and that's it. And I guess this is the crux of everything that was happening in the WCA for the last 20, 25 years, was this political to-in and fro-in. I don't think there was too much argument around the scientific principles of what was being discussed.
Right.
It was the political, manifestation of that. Like, how do we get an agreement that we can all sign up to? And I think, that's the frustration, but I guess that's the reality of our, current systems.
Yeah, no, 100%. I totally agree. And I wanted to kind of put that out into the podcast sphere, because I think it's something that a lot of people look at as a scientist, but also just from the outside in. It'd be like, well, hold on, why do we need all these different measures and all these different tools? They are very important tools when we look at fisheries management on a global scale. And so I'm glad we're able to distinguish that. But that's something that's always been kind of like, well, why isn't the science just enough? So
yeah, I mean, it's the same with climate change science, right? That's probably an even better example where there's even less uncertainty. Fish stock assessments, we're pretty good at it, especially when we have a lot of data, but there's always uncertainty. There's always you're trying to hit this single point that we've kind of come up with of maximum sustainable yield. There is a lot of uncertainty in it, and as scientists, we try and accommodate that and explain it. But in climate change, there's a lot less uncertainty, yet still we see this. It seems so simple, right? Like 100%. What we have to do. Actually doing it apparently becomes a lot more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get into more of this agreement, can you just help explain how subsidies work? Obviously it doesn't have to go into great detail because it's different for each country, but this is a big part of this agreement, and the big argument around overfishing is like, we need to stop subsidizing certain fisheries or certain types of fishing because it's perpetuating the overfishing problem that we have. So can you just kind of go into a description for the audience to be like, hey, like, what is subsidies and why is it important to have certain regulations around it?
Yeah, for sure. And there's various versions of definitions of what a subsidy, and especially a fishery subsidy. I'm going to take the WTO definition, and that's generally all my work kind of is based on that, because because of this agreement and the negotiations of this agreement. So from the WTO's point of view, a subsidy kind of needs three elements. So it's a direct or indirect financial transfer. So direct, essentially, here's some money. Indirect is like, maybe you don't owe me that money you owed me before. So it's a transfer of wealth. The second part is it has to come from a government or a public body and go to the private industry. So it's government, it's public to private, indirect or direct transfer, and then that transfer has to confer some kind of benefit. Historically, there's a lot of reasons why governments might do that. You might want to incentivize the development of a particular sector. So we hear a lot about subsidies for offshore renewable energy, for example. I mean, we also provide subsidies for offshore oil and gas, but that's a different conversation. So you might want to incentivize the development of sector that maybe is quite costly at the beginning of that development. You might want to address social equity issues. So you may want to support the wages of certain sectors of society, for example, or particular jobs that maybe are really important. We need to kind of subsidize the wages there to encourage people into it, for example, like health workers maybe. And then the other one that we're talking about today is to address conservation concerns. So in the UK, for example, a lot of farmers might get paid to not farm up to the edge of a river, or to leave certain fields to go wild, or to kind of have this crop rotation. And the government might give them money, so they benefit, and then we benefit from this like additional conservation benefit. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of different reasons why. Another key reason that's often actually unspoken is this competition element. Particularly in fisheries, if we're all targeting the same tuna stocks, well, if we help out the costs of our fishing fleet, they might do a bit of a better job, or manage to get a bit more of that fish, or sell the fish cheaper, access certain markets.
Right.
So there's stated reasons or drivers of subsidies, and then there might be hidden ones as well.
Yeah.
In the case of fisheries, the harm that they can cause, as I said earlier, they can cause what we call trade injuries, which the WTO have largely been focused on. That's steel from one nation is being subsidized, so it's really cheap and changes the market. The WTO might step in and be like, you shouldn't subsidize that. So you can get these trade injuries, but in fisheries we get what we call this capacity enhancing effect, and that's the ones we kind of call harmful fisheries subsidies. And what that is it's basically that subsidy the government give is lowering the cost of fishing, and or increasing their profits. But let's say lowering the cost of fishing. By doing that, what we end up with is it results in overcapacity. So each fishing vessel, or the fleet as a whole, essentially gets too big for what the fish stock can handle. Mm-hmm. So, like, really simply, you have too many boats chasing too few fish, right? And instead of like in what you might call the free market, situation, some of those vessels might drop out or go bust because there's not enough fish. I can't make profit. I have to leave. But if you start reducing the cost of fishing, or reducing the cost of fuel, for example, you kind of maintain this fishing fleet at a scale, at a size that wouldn't actually exist based on either the size of the stock or the economics of the fishery. So we kind of artificially hold these fleets, at a size that we wouldn't really see without the subsidies. And that's overcapacity. And when you have overcapacity, it tends to lead to overfishing. Yes, you can have really strict rules in there that prevent that, but the science kind of shows that doesn't always happen, as we talked about just a minute ago, right? You can have these stock assessments say only take X tons, but it's even harder when you've got boats and a lot of a huge inflated industry on this particular fishery, maybe saying like we need more tons because otherwise we're not going to be able to pay all these hundreds of thousands of workers potentially.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the issue we have here. It's this economic tool that actually then ends up having an ecological impact by creating a bloated fishing industry.
With subsidies, have you seen models where there's alternative to subsidies, or alternative to subsidies proposed that might work better or have worked better in the past?
Yeah, I mean, so, generally we have these kind of three categories of fisheries subsidies. So I talked there a lot about these harmful capacity enhancing subsidies, but we also have beneficial subsidies. That's a bit like the example I gave you of the farmer who might be getting paid to leave some, not farm right up to the edge of a river to ensure the river stays healthier. That's a beneficial subsidy. We have that in fisheries too, that might be to pay fishers not to fish in a particular area, or to use to help fund the replacement of certain gear that they have to a more environmentally friendly gear. And then we have these ones we call ambiguous, which is like, we don't really know what affects it. It might depend who you give it to or how you apply it. So they're kind of a grey area. But
right.
Let's think we have these harmful and we have these beneficial. You know, a lot of the times when I'm advocating for removing harmful subsidies, and this is a point I try and really emphasise, especially to my industry colleagues, is I'm not saying stop funding fishing. Don't invest in fisheries. I want to see money being spent on fisheries. I think it's vital. I'd like to see more money spent on it. I just don't want to see it spent in a way that incentivises overcapacity and leads to overfishing. Like, let's find beneficial ways that we can invest in our fishing fleets to try and make them more efficient without adding to capacity, or to help like boost the amount of fish available, or lower the impact it has on the rest of the ecosystem. So a lot of this, what we hope this agreement might achieve is a reduction in harmful subsidies, but really we want to see that then spent elsewhere in a beneficial format.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's really great, and a lot of these subsidies are coming from tax dollars, right? They're coming from the budget of the government that's largely funded by tax. It could be funded by other sources depending on where this money comes from, but it's largely funded by tax dollars. So some people, citizens, I know here in Canada, we're always like, why are we funding, like big time for a problem for Canada, or a big contentious issue is, funding oil and gas subsidies here, right? So people are like, why are we doing this? I don't want to do this, even though it's like it's a necessity when you look at oil and gas, and the benefits usually outweigh the subsidies that we have to pay. But a lot of people will say that, will be like, why are we funding, if they want to decrease overfishing, why are we funding, subsidies for fishing in general? But it's not necessarily, not all subsidies are going to encourage overfishing or illegal fishing. That's not what the subsidy is for, correct? Like the subsidy is for, the agreement, I assume, with the people who are receiving, and the companies who are receiving this subsidy, is to do legal fishing under the law of that country, and not to do that. I know that sounds stupid to say that. As I say that, I'm like, Andrew, why are we talking about this? But I want people to really understand the purpose of a subsidy is to help with the industry, benefit not only the citizens, but also that industry, but also to contribute to the legal fishing of a specific stock, correct?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that many subsidies are dished out with that kind of, with environmental destruction in mind. And also, a lot of the kind of the drivers of maybe providing these subsidies, again, as you say, it's not to encourage illegal fishing or overfishing. In many cases, these governments are probably trying to support a lot of jobs that may be, in the balance. A lot of these jobs, they're not, you can't predict year on year, how secure they are, because they're based on weather and the biology of the fishery. So, I think some of the subsidies are provided with intentions like that. Also, although we've talked a lot about the business of fishing and that element of it, ultimately is also producing a food source, right? And again, we see a lot of subsidies being spent on, food production. A big argument around that is food security. Sadly, that doesn't always actually kind of add up when you look at the end result, in that we're subsidising a lot of fishing vessels, in the EU or the UK, where the fish actually goes elsewhere. Like, it's not supporting food security in the UK. So, it's a really complicated system, and a lot of kind of what we do is, and what this agreement should be doing is trying to reveal, what is the actual result of this subsidisation. And when we do that, can we have a better, more informed discussion about, okay, what are the intentions of these subsidies, and what is the actual outcome? Are we seeing, are we achieving what we say we're going to do with this? Are we actually achieving, environmental degradation at home, or taxpayers' money is being used to, it's resulting in environmental degradation and food security for, another nation? If that's the result, like, is this the best way to do this? Is there a better way we can do this? So, Yeah, the intention is very rarely, I would say, if ever, to fund overfishing.
Right.
But as I say, when the data, when the science says that's what's happening, I think there needs to be a reconsideration of how we're funding that.
Of course.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. No, please do. Go ahead.
Just to emphasize again, not saying don't fund it, not saying take the money out, just let's find a better way to spend it, right?
Well, and in comes this WTO agreement, right? This World Trade Organization agreement, where this is like essentially like a framework that countries can use to implement into their own legal structure to say, hey, you know what, this is a great way to go forward based on a lot of research that's been done, a lot of expertise that's been put together. This is what we recommend, how you sort of put in the rules to put in subsidies or not give subsidies to specific fleets who are not abiding by the laws, not only of the sea, but also by their own country, which for a lot of countries who have signed on to the UN Law of the Sea is the same thing, right? So, I think that's really important coming into this agreement. So I want to get that, the reasoning why we're putting in this for a lot of our audience members here, and because this is all stuff we all had to learn, in terms of what's been happening with these subsidies. How does this continue to happen? In many countries, it does get a little out of hand sometimes, in terms of illegal fishing, as we've seen, and so. Let's talk about this agreement. How important is this as a first step to the battle of really reducing and hopefully one day eliminating, overfishing and illegal fishing?
Yeah, I mean, as we said at the beginning, it's really important. We are celebrating this agreement, and we'll talk about this, and we'll probably talk about it right now, actually, about how this is just the first step. This was never intended to be the end of this discussion. This is, right. It's. A lot of us are referring to it as Fish 1. Fish 2 is being negotiated right now, and we can maybe come on to that later. But yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important. What it does at the moment is it first tackles the worst kind of... It tackles who these subsidies are going to. It doesn't yet tackle subsidies because of the nature of certain subsidies being bad. It tackles who these subsidies are going to, like we said earlier. So what it does is these ratifying members, I think there's 112 now, are now bound by law to stop providing subsidies to any illegal fishing. Who determines whether it's illegal fishing or not? We'll see how that actually plays out in reality. At the moment, from the text, it says it's either the vessel that the flag state that the vessel is fishing under, the coastal state where the vessel is fishing, or if they're fishing in the jurisdiction of an RFMO, a regional fisheries management organisation, they can determine. So they're the three groups, the entities who can determine it's illegal fishing.
Right.
At the moment, we have all the kind of official lists of IUU vessels in the world. I think at the moment adds up to about 230 vessels. Okay. So hopefully there'll be a more stringent way of actually doing, because if it's only 230 vessels that are going to have subsidies pulled, it's not going to make a huge dint in the 22 billion of harmful subsidies currently provided. The second prohibition that it has is it stops subsidies to fishing on overfished stocks, which again sounds really strong on paper, has the potential to be really strong on paper. The entity that determines whether the stock is overfished is the country whose waters it's in. So it's kind of marking your own homework. There's also a bit of a loophole that says, if you have management measures in place that, show that it's that are aimed to rebuild the stock, then you can keep subsidizing. And again, it's the subsidizing member that can be like, yeah, it's overfished, but, we've got these management measures in place that aim to rebuild it, so we can keep subsidizing. So, again, it's a really great first step. Hopefully over the course of implementation, we can really tighten the kind of nut on that and be like, no, you haven't rebuilt the stock, stop subsidizing it.
Right.
And then the last one is subsidies to fishing on the unregulated high seas, which is a small fraction of kind of global fisheries. Most fisheries are in coastal waters, but it's quite an important one because that's the fishing activity that basically is, the Wild West. There's very very few rules on that, so probably shouldn't be subsidising that. So they're the kind of three main prohibitions that it includes. As I said, there's loopholes, and we'll see how it's implemented. There's a couple of really strong articles in there that I like. There's an article on transparency, so WTO members are now going to have to be a lot more stringent in the information they give to the WTO every year on the subsidies they provide, who they go to, what fish stocks are these subsidies impacting. That's a really great step, because in the 9 years I've been doing this research, there's often quite poor data, and we're often filling gaps in with kind of models or through poorer data sources. And then another one is this article that allows member states to basically hold each other accountable. And that's the one that I think could be really key to the success of this, is how well will each of these members be able to hold each other to account, to say, show us you're working, prove to us that, these management measures are helping to rebuild the stock. And again, I think also that's probably where civil society comes in, trying to work with different members to ask for this information, or to get them to kind of show us what subsidies you're providing, like what subsidies are going to these distant water fishing fleets, or which fisheries are you subsidising in your waters. And I think that could be a really key part to it.
Yeah, I think it's really important. A question with that: so you have WTO members. And there are 166 WTO members as of July 17, 2024. I just looked it up. Comoros is the last country to join, which is great. So you have these WTO members who have to abide by this transparency rules when they report to the WTO, which is great. So it's almost separate of whether they ratified or not. If they want to be part of the WTO, they have to submit to this transparency rule for fishing. Is that, am I getting that right, or do they still have to ratify this agreement to do that? I guess that's the question at hand, right?
So, I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but members have always been able to and should have been notifying the WTO, before this agreement came in. It has been improving over the years as these negotiations have been getting a lot closer. And since they agreed the text, we've seen more countries notifying with better, more detailed information. So I think there is a requirement to report to some extent. I think what this agreement does is it really sets out, like, this is what you must include, and the periodicity. So it has to be annual now, unless you're a kind of if you're a developed or least developing country, developed country, they're the terms that are used. Then you can report every 4 years. So there are parts of this agreement again that try and what they call special and differential treatment, and that either allows like a lower threshold or longer time periods for developed and least developed countries to adhere to the rules, which is a good thing.
And that's usually because they don't always have the resources to, like, the people and stuff to do that reporting, and even the means to get that data at this point, which obviously, not great in terms of a way of understanding what's happening in their fishery, but also understanding that these countries are trying. They have other things that they're focused. They just may not have the people, the resources to be able to accomplish an annual type of reporting, right?
It's true to that as well. The other thing is it really helps to, this is part of the goal, is to ensure that the biggest subsidizers, those with the broadest shoulders, burden the most, have the biggest burden from this agreement. So just to go a few stats that might help the listener on this. We talked earlier about $22 billion a year is provided in harmful fisheries subsidies across the whole world. But when we look at kind of how that breaks down, who's providing it, the top 10 are providing about 70% of the top 10, countries are providing about 70% of all that. So that's China, the EU, the US, Japan, Korea, Indonesia. I don't know whether that. I think that's about the right order. So 70% is provided by those 10 entities. Some of those are actually developed nations, although they won't be able to benefit from the special and differential treatment. Right. And then even within that, so you have 10, let's call them like the richest countries providing most of the subsidies. When you look even within that, about 90% of that is then going to the large scale fishing fleet. So the biggest boats, often fishing, furthest away from shore, hardest to kind of monitor, control. And then even when there's so many layers to this, and then below that, we found about, a recent paper we did, we found that about 20 to 37% of all those harmful subsidies are actually being given to vessels not even fishing their own waters. So it's often the EU or China, for example, will be subsidising vessels that are fishing elsewhere, generally in Africa or Oceania. So there's a real inequality kind of baked into how subsidies, who provides them and who they provide them to, if that makes sense. So, so part of this special and differential treatment is also because, as we just said there, 10 countries account for, 70% of all of it. So it's kind of to put the emphasis on like who this agreement should really be targeting, and it's the biggest subsidizers. That's not to say that harm can't be done, by spending less money. It's just that, when you look at it on a global scale, which as the WTO, is interesting, kind of global trade and systems. Yeah, that's how it's done.
And I think this is really important when we talk about this type of work and what it seems to bring in terms of like countries really want to be part of this WTO. Like it's a very important aspect to their pride to be part of a global sort of agreement, a global organization, to say, hey, we're participating in all these things. That's something that I've realized when it comes to policy and to these being part of these large organizations or these large agreements is it's a prideful thing. We're a part of this. We're part of the Paris Agreement. We're part of the WTO, and we're abiding by the rules of these organizing bodies to say, hey, let's do this thing. So when an agreement like this comes out, it's important for like we can. It's not like you can use it as like a name and shame of like these countries haven't ratified this yet. Like why haven't they ratified it? But it's like you can say, hey, look, like if you want to really be a part of this WTO, incorporating this agreement into your laws not only benefits your fishery, but also benefits like for the long-term aspect of your fishery. So I think that's a really good point to hammer home that I want to get across is because of this, countries have a little bit more incentive to be a part of this agreement, especially some of the top 10 that you mentioned just earlier that are providing the most harmful subsidies, the most amount of harmful subsidies. But I think there's also like some really cool things. Although we've identified already some potential loopholes that countries can get through. But I really like that the subsidies that enable fishing on unregulated high seas, like you can't do that. So this is really interesting because I'm working on this story I mentioned it to you before we recorded that for the next episode. And one of the things that I found is like they're using SAR, which is like a type of radar, like satellite radar, that identifies like the presence of fishing boats. They know what these fishing boats look like, and SAR can really identify these. They come and look up like black dots or black objects. So you can identify using that in the combination of a number of other things, AI, AIS and stuff, you can identify which boats are in the high seas. And like they shouldn't be in the high seas, and eventually you can get where they're from if they're part of the AIS program, and you can get so like I feel like there's a lot of potential in that last or the third thing that you said in terms of the prohibitions, especially as like if you're found on the high seas and it's we know it's unregulated, we know it's difficult, then you can remove those subsidies from that vessel or that company that monitors that vessel or works that fleet or vessel. Just like that, like you have the capability to do that if you incorporate and ratify this agreement. I feel like there's a benefit in that if people start to use that. Now there are limitations with this technology because it only passes a certain amount of times, and it could be difficult to do that. But just having that access, there's a potential there to really be able to enforce these types of subsidies on the high seas, which traditionally has been impossible to navigate and to really monitor, right?
Yeah, and just important as well to say a lot of these fishing on the unregulated high seas. So this is generally any fishing that's outside of a regional RFMO or what we call regional fisheries bodies, RFBs. It's not illegal. there are no laws that regulate
Right.
it. So they're not necessarily not supposed to be there. But it's just that there isn't any rules that regulate it. So I'm not sure what proportion of fisheries are unregulated on the high seas. It's kind of I generally work on fisheries that have regulation.
Yeah, of course.
But I think and I was thinking about this the other day. Like I think this could be a strong article in terms of maybe future fisheries. I hear a lot about the potential of like mesopelagic fisheries. So these are, I think, as I understand it, these high seas fisheries of fish stocks are below the surface a bit, I think, and they're generally like this, I hate to say untapped resource, but they're not really targeted at the moment.
Yeah.
But from my understanding, initially when I looked at, these fisheries, the cost of them, for the return is so low that it looks like the only way they might be able to establish these fisheries is as kind of, experimental fisheries, or I assume by heavily subsidising it. So I wonder if this article that stops that actually also might be quite useful for preventing, these experimental fisheries being, trying to target this resource that's currently not being targeted, but because it's so inefficient, it needs subsidies. Maybe this might prevent things like that. I don't know. As I said, I think throughout all of this, it's really going to be around, and this is what we want WTO members to focus on now, is like start implementing it. Show us how are we going to make sure that this actually has some impact and starts to, remove or redirect these harmful subsidies. And I think, seeing really, because the text, as you said at the beginning, when it might have been off mic, some of it's a bit vague, and it's some of these, especially legal texts, you almost need a qualification in how to read legal
right.
text to understand, and there's all these footnotes and if this then so I think that's going to be key. Is like start reporting what subsidies you give now. Let's see what this does over time, and maybe in 2 or 3 years when we can see a change in how subsidies are provided, and then ultimately, hopefully, that will start leading into more sustainable fisheries, ideally, or more equitable fisheries, as well, hopefully.
Yeah, it's interesting because what you mentioned there is like being transparent and identifying what subsidy is given out for what, in terms of fisheries. I was just actually going to look it up, being like, I don't even know, like I live in Canada, I don't even know what subsidies are given. And to a lot of these industries, we don't know how many, like what's given for, how much money is given, what companies or parts of the industry like get more than others. What do we get back from it? I feel like that information, I'm hoping that information is out there, as a government, because it should be transparent. But sometimes I based on your smile, just being like, that probably isn't readily available to your average sort of citizen who might want to know. And maybe there's like, I know like with Canada, we get like Freedom of Information Act, so you can submit a Freedom of Information Act if you want to know specific data that they have to abide by, and usually it's a bit of a crapshoot. I know journalists do that quite a bit. That information is usually not readily available, I assume, right?
Yeah, it's patchy at best. Obviously, certain countries or certain kind of groups are much better at this. I'm was based in the European Union. I'm in the UK, but the European Union are kind of, they have incredible kind of fiscal management. You can find out a lot of information about the provision of finance, of funding, particularly for the fisheries sector. Not everywhere's like that. I think part of the issue as well is the format of how these subsidies might be provided. It's generally quite relatively straightforward to find direct transfers of, this fishing fleet or this individual vessel got money to put in a brand new engine. Stuff like that is relative. There's always a paper chain. It's more the indirect subsidies, or one of the subsidies I work quite a bit on is fuel tax concessions, which sadly won't be kind of picked up by this agreement. But what that is basically we all pay tax for fuel when we go to the pump to fill up the gas in your car. And I would say all fishing industries don't have to pay tax on fuel generally, or they pay a very reduced rate of tax.
Right.
And so that's the subsidy, right? Because you've reduced the cost of of fishing by reducing the cost of, the arguments around it may be valid or may not, around competition or like to shield them from fuel price hikes, things like that. But regardless, like it's a subsidy, but it's one that isn't generally, there's no paper trail for that. And actually, we've worked with governments before where we've modelled what is the cost of that, and they've then used our modelled estimate as like, cool, this is the fuel tax concession that we provide, because they just haven't, they haven't done the working out of how much fuel is used by the industry every year, what's the reduction in cost per litre, and things like that. So hopefully, we'll see with this transparency article what information the governments do have, like, and what they don't, because not all subsidies are born equal, as it were.
No, exactly. And I think it's important to identify that and to understand that. And I think it's great. You being coming from a science background and working with policies, seeing agreements like this, do you automatically identify, okay, this is where we need to direct our research in the future to help with this agreement? Like, from an Oceana perspective, when you look at this agreement, what are you looking at for in the future of how this will shape the future? Is this going to have, do you think this is going to have I guess the first question is, do you think this is going to have a big impact on the fishing industry worldwide? Just this agreement, not steps later.
I think it will, but and we'll get on to those.
Caveats, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it will, because this is the first legally binding agreement on fisheries subsidies. Like, we now have rules that say, that even recognise, certain subsidies are bad and we need to stop providing them and redirect them. Like, I think that is a bit of a sea change, and even because that was a debate quite a while ago. Hasn't been from, I don't think, for the last 5-6 years, as they've really been sitting down and trying to negotiate this text. So I think it is going to have a big change. Will this Fish One, from my reading of it, result in a significant reduction in harmful fisheries subsidies next year? Maybe not. And I think because of some of these caveats, some of these loopholes, the fact that it doesn't quite, a third of the world's fish catch is made by countries that haven't yet ratified it. So when you start looking at that and taking out the little bits that aren't quite covered yet, it starts to reduce. But having said that, as we said at the beginning, we do celebrate this. I think it is important, and I think it's a really important platform to build off. And as I've said 2 or 3 times now, I think we're going to learn a lot more as this starts getting implemented. I think I potentially see a role for Oceana and other entities is in trying to hold, the governments where we operate accountable, asking for that transparency, looking for the receipts and the evidence of, okay, are you subsidizing this overfish stock? If yes, are you going to stop that? Or what's your evidence that the stock is rebuilding? So trying to use this as a tool to kind of say, you're now legally bound. You ratified this. You negotiated it first, then ratified it. Let's end to this with kind of honesty and really trying to actually adhere to the letter, the spirit of the agreement, rather than maybe trying to find these loopholes. So I think it is going to have a big impact in that sense, in the sense that it's the first real tangible step. After 25 years of talking, and maybe this would happen. We now have something that we can hold up. It's in force, and we now have, as I said, the next thing, 4 years to get the rest of the agreement, to make it, in the WTO's own words, to make it comprehensive.
Right. Now, from for ratification, so there's people can sign on that they like the agreement, but then they have to ratify it. That means they have to actually, once they ratify it, that means they're putting in laws in their own, they're incorporating the components of this that they have to incorporate to fully ratify it and put it in their laws. This is something from an individual perspective. What can people do to help that ratification, to help countries like their own country, to sign on to that ratification? So, for instance, I live in Canada. I want my country to ratify this. as an individual, what can I do to ensure that this country, like my country, ratifies this deal?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully Canada, and as a Canadian as well, has ratified it, so that's
Yes.
good.
Oh,
But if we
great.
were in a country, but prior to that, you know, we're members, and there's dozens of members of this coalition called the Stop Funding Overfishing Coalition, and certain colleagues in that have been doing really tireless work on trying to push nations and work with nations and their delegation at the WTO in Geneva to try and get this, even to just get the text agreed, the individual words on it. But part of what they do as well is work with local CSOs, local NGOs to try and, campaign or advocate in those particular countries. So I it may not be easy, but I think maybe first step would be check out Stop Funding Overfishing, see who their membership is, if there's members from your country, and trying to see, do they have campaigns on fisheries subsidies or letters that you can sign to get sent to your politicians. And if not, anybody can contact, I hope, in most, countries in the world can contact their politician and say, like, this is an important issue, what is happening? Or like your environmental minister, your fisheries minister, what are we doing about the WTO subsidies agreement?
Right.
And as you say, I forget, I can't calculate off the top of my head, but I think we've got 112 ratifications. Did you say
112 out of 166? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a good, 50, what's that, 54?
54.
Correctly. Yep. Never do maths live. But so there's 54 member states members that haven't yet done it. Some of those will be landlocked countries, whether they ratify it or not, I don't know. And bearing in mind, this only addresses marine fisheries. It doesn't do inland fisheries, in
Right.
lakes or rivers or aquaculture.
Right.
So some of those landlocked countries won't be ratifying it, or probably won't. So there's still, and there's some, I think there's 2 out of the top 10 subsidizers still to ratify, and some important players in there. So there's a lot of kind of work still to be done, even on ratification. But I think the focus, especially in those 112 countries, is on implementation. Getting this thing up and running.
Yeah, because that takes a while too. Like, it's not just there's the one of ratifying it, but then the country actually has to put it into place, into their legal framework, to say, hey, this is what we're going to be doing, and then they have to actually act on it. They actually have to put out those transparent reports. They have to tell people, their citizens, of like, this is how we're going to go forward. That takes a long time. Government works slow. We know that, and it takes a while. I like to, the idea of talking to your local member of parliament for Canada and the UK, as we have members of parliament, or your government representative to sort of be like, hey, where are we on this? Like, they need to report to us, that being like, hey, like, we're like, this is what I know we ratified it as Canadians, but where do we go from here? Like, how does this proceed? And make sure that it's on the top of their priority list, because that's.
And remember, this is taxpayers' money, right? Like that definition we had at the beginning of what is a subsidy. It's public money being transferred directly into private sectors. So, I think that we have a right to know where it's going, who it's going to, and what it's being used for, or what it's incentivizing.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's really important. Dan, this has been absolutely amazing. I really appreciate you coming on. I know it was a bit of a last minute thing that we kind of put together here, and I do really appreciate you coming on and breaking down this agreement. This is, I feel like, I think you agree, this is a great step forward. We still have a lot of work to do in making sure that illegal fishing is done, and we're not funding illegal fishing and overfishing. And so we'll put people onto that Stop Funding Overfishing website so people can get access. I'll put in the description all the material that Oceana has come up with, based on this agreement, but also on your fishing campaigns as well, overfishing campaigns as well. You guys have been so great to us to provide all this information. We really appreciate you coming on, and look forward to having you back on to explain more of fishing and what the new technologies and everything like that's coming into play.
Yeah, and hey, hopefully it's not 25 years until the next
the
next agreement on fisheries subsidies, right? So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it'll be nice to see like maybe potential amendments to these ones as we start to learn how countries are reacting or even not reacting to some of these things. And I think like there's the part of, you know, the ratification, the putting into the legal framework, acting on it, but making sure they're acting on it. And that's where I feel like supporting organizations such as Oceana in wherever country you live in and wherever you guys work. I know we have an Oceana Canada here, into supporting those organizations, into, you know, working with the government, not just pressuring them, but working with the government to make sure that they're implementing this agreement and parts of the agreement that are part of their legal framework. So I think that's a really important thing as well. And we appreciate Oceana for doing that. So Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. I'd love to have you back on.
Yeah. Cheers, Andre. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan, for coming on once again to break down this important agreement. I feel like I said at the beginning, this is a turning point in the way we are looking at how to manage subsidies with fisheries and to ensure that we are not going to subsidize overfishing or illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. This is an important aspect to every country, and 112 out of 166 members of the WTO have ratified it, including my own country, Canada, which is great. But there are still some big fishing nations who have not ratified it, and we need them to ratify. The more countries that are a part of this, the better shape it'll be. This is a work in progress, of course, as this agreement has come out, and this has taken a long time to put together, but there still needs to be more stringent rules as we go forward. But we're going to see how this plays out initially. Conservation is done in steps. It's not done all at once. We have not solved overfishing with this agreement, but we are moving in the right direction, and I think that's really important. So I'm very happy that Dan was able to come on. He actually contacted me to say, hey, we need to talk about this on your podcast. You ready? I'm like, yes, absolutely, 100%, let's do it. And so he came out and did that, and I really appreciate him doing that. So that's always great to have Dan and Oceana and the work they do to share this type of information, to break it down for us. We really appreciate Oceana and Dan for doing this. So thank you so much to them for coming on the podcast, and I want to thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments, let me know in the comments below. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you're watching the audio or listening to the audio version, I should say, I really appreciate you listening to the audio version, because we started with audio. We're going to continue with audio always. And so if you want to get a hold of me, you can do so using Instagram. Just DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. Or you can go on the website, go to speakupforblue.com/contact, fill out the form. It goes right to my personal email. Love to have a chat with you about that. And that's the episode for today. I want to thank you so much for joining me on another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, from the True North Strong and Free. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.